Welcome back to Easy English Talk Podcast.
Welcome back to the Easy English Talk Podcast, everyone. It's great to have you here with us today. And Priya, hey, how are you doing? How's your day been so far?
Ryan, honestly, it's been one of those days where the morning felt like it lasted forever. I had too much coffee and too many browser tabs open, as usual. But I am really happy to be here now. How about you?
The too many tabs problem. I know that feeling very well. My day was busy but good. I was actually reading and preparing for today's episode, and I have to say, this topic really pulled me in. I could not stop reading once I started.
Same here. I spent a big part of my evening going through articles and historical notes, and I kept thinking, why did no one explain this to me in a simple, clear way before? It is such an important story.
And that is exactly why we are doing this episode. So, to everyone listening or watching right now, hello, welcome, and thank you for being here. We really appreciate your time and your support for this podcast.
Yes, a big welcome to all of you, wherever you are joining us from today. Whether you are at home, on your commute, or taking a break at work, we're glad you're here with us.
We would love to know where in the world you are listening from today. Drop your city or country in the comments. It is always so wonderful to see how far this podcast travels. We have listeners from so many different places, and that never stops amazing us.
Also, if this podcast has been helping you with your English, or even helping you think more clearly about the world around you, please do let us know. Your feedback means everything to us and helps us keep improving every episode.
Absolutely. And if you are new here, leave a comment and say hello. We genuinely read them, and it always makes our day. Now, before we get started, I want to say something about today's episode.
Yes, please do, because today feels a little different from our usual episodes, and I think listeners will notice that right away.
Today's topic is a little different from what we usually discuss. Normally, we talk about habits, communication, personal growth, and life skills. But today, we felt it was really important to step back and talk about something bigger, something that affects millions of people and is in the news constantly.
And it is a topic that a lot of people have strong feelings about, but may not fully understand the history behind. We thought that if we can help even one person understand this more clearly, then this episode is worth making.
So today, we are discussing who started it, the real history behind Iran versus Israel.
This is a topic that comes up again and again in global news, in politics, and in everyday conversations. But very few people actually know how this conflict began, how it developed, and why it is still happening today.
And that is exactly what we are going to explore. By the end of this episode, you will have a much clearer picture of this long and complicated relationship. You will understand the key moments in history, the turning points, and the reasons behind what we see in the news today.
Whether you follow international news closely or you're just trying to understand what is happening in the world, this episode will give you a solid foundation. And it will also give you something else, a way to think about conflict, history, and how the past shapes the present.
So stay with us. This episode is worth your full attention. Let us start from the beginning, and I mean the real beginning, before the tension, before the missiles, before everything we see today.
Because here's something that surprises many people. Iran and Israel were not always enemies. In fact, for a long period of modern history, they were quite close. That's where the story really begins.
To understand how two countries went from being allies to being some of the most serious enemies in the world today, we have to go back to the mid-20th century. And the first thing to understand is the region itself.
The Middle East is one of the most complex regions in the world. It has ancient history, deep religious roots, and it sits at the crossroads of many powerful interests, political, economic, and cultural. So everything that happens there carries a lot of weight.
And both Iran and Israel are very old civilizations. The Persian Empire, which is the ancient root of modern Iran, and the ancient kingdoms of the Jewish people both go back thousands of years. Their histories are long, layered, and deeply connected to this part of the world.
But the modern conflict we're talking about today is not about ancient history. It's mostly a product of the 20th century, a century of wars, revolutions, and major changes in global power. So let's focus there.
Let us go to the year 1948. That is when the modern state of Israel was officially created. The United Nations voted to divide the land known as British-controlled Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. Israel declared independence in May of that year.
This moment was celebrated by Jewish communities around the world, especially those who had survived the Holocaust in Europe, the mass murder of 6 million Jewish people by the Nazi regime during World War II. For them, having a homeland was not just political, it was deeply personal and emotional.
But for many Arab nations and Palestinian Arabs living in that land, the creation of Israel was a painful and devastating event. They called it the Nakba, which in Arabic means the catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced from their homes.
A war broke out almost immediately. Arab countries, including Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, declared war on the newly formed Israel. Israel survived that war, and in doing so, it gained even more land than the original UN partition had proposed.
This war and the tensions it created set the stage for decades of conflict in the region. But here's the important thing to notice. At this point in 1948, Iran was not deeply involved. Iran did not send soldiers to fight Israel. Iran's relationship with Israel was actually quite different from the other countries in the region.
Right. Iran at that time was a monarchy. The country was ruled by a Shah, a king, named Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. He was a modernizing ruler, strongly supported by the United States and Western countries. And under his rule, Iran had a relatively warm relationship with Israel.
In fact, Iran was the second Muslim-majority country in the world to recognize Israel as a state, the first being Turkey. That is a fact that surprises many people today. Back then, Israel and Iran had real diplomatic ties, trade connections, and even some military cooperation.
There were Israeli businesses operating in Iran. Iranian oil was being refined and transported with Israeli help. Iranian and Israeli officials met regularly. It was a functioning, practical relationship between two countries with shared interests, mainly a shared concern about Arab nationalism and Soviet influence in the region.
So the big question is, what changed? If Iran and Israel had this working relationship, what happened to turn it into the deep, dangerous hostility we see today? The answer to that question happened in one dramatic year, 1979.
1979 was a year of massive change in Iran. After decades of authoritarian rule under the Shah, who was increasingly seen as corrupt, brutal, and too closely tied to America, the Iranian people rose up in a revolution. Millions of people took to the streets demanding change.
The Shah fled the country in January of 1979, and shortly after, a religious scholar named Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran from exile. He became the supreme leader of a new kind of government, the Islamic Republic of Iran. This was not just a change in leadership, it was a complete transformation of the country.
Khomeini's ideology was very different from the Shah's. He believed in a government ruled by Islamic law, deeply opposed to American influence, deeply opposed to Western culture, and very strongly opposed to the existence of Israel. For Khomeini, Israel was not a legitimate state. He called it a Zionist entity, not a real country, but an occupation.
And with that, the entire relationship between Iran and Israel collapsed overnight. Iran cut all diplomatic ties with Israel. The Israeli embassy in Tehran was handed over to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Everything changed, completely and suddenly.
This is such a crucial moment to understand. The Iran-Israel conflict as we know it today was essentially born in 1979. Before that revolution, there was cooperation. After it, there was hostility. The revolution did not just change Iran's government, it changed the entire shape of the Middle Eastern politics.
And here's something else important about 1979. That same year, Iran went through another massive crisis, one that sent shockwaves around the world and created permanent damage in Iran's relationship with the United States.
Yes, in November of 1979, a group of Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage. They held them for 444 days. It was one of the most dramatic international crises of the 20th century.
This hostage crisis made the United States deeply hostile towards Iran, and that hostility has lasted ever since. America imposed heavy economic sanctions on Iran. Relations were completely severed, and this American-Iranian tension became deeply connected to the Iran-Israel conflict because the United States is Israel's most important ally.
So now we have this triangle of tension. Iran, deeply hostile to both Israel and America, Israel relying heavily on American support, and America deeply suspicious and resentful of Iran. This triangle, mostly formed in 1979, is still the basic structure of the conflict today.
But the story does not stop there. The 1980s brought another huge development, one that made Iran's situation even more complicated and more painful. In September 1980, Iraq, under its dictator Saddam Hussein, invaded Iran. This began the Iran-Iraq War, one of the longest and deadliest wars of the 20th century.
The war lasted 8 years, from 1980 to 1988. Hundreds of thousands of people died on both sides. Iran was fighting for its survival. And here's the complicated part. The United States and many Western countries actually supported Iraq during this war, not Iran.
This is something that many people in the West do not know or remember. America provided intelligence, weapons, and financial support to Saddam Hussein during this war, the same Saddam Hussein who would later become America's enemy in the Gulf War of 1991. At the time, America supported him because they wanted to weaken Iran.
From Iran's perspective, this confirmed everything. America was not just an adversary, America was actually helping to destroy Iran. This period deepened Iran's distrust of Western powers enormously, and it hardened the ideology of the Islamic Republic.
Now let us move into the 1990s, because this is when another very important element enters the story, the question of nuclear technology. Iran began developing its nuclear program, and the world, especially Israel and America, became very concerned about what that program was really for.
Iran said its nuclear program was peaceful, just for energy. Israel and the United States said they did not believe that. They believed Iran was trying to build a nuclear weapon. And if Iran, a country that openly calls for the destruction of Israel, had a nuclear weapon, that would be an existential threat for Israel.
The word existential is very important here. An existential threat is not just a danger. It is a threat to your very existence, a threat that could end your life as a nation. Israel, a small country surrounded by hostile neighbors, took this possibility very seriously.
And so the nuclear program became one of the most dangerous points of tension between Iran and Israel. Israel has conducted covert operations, meaning secret operations, to slow down Iran's nuclear development. There have been assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists. There have been cyber attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities.
The most famous cyber attack was called Stuxnet, a computer virus that was reportedly developed jointly by Israel and the United States and used to physically damage Iran's nuclear centrifuges. It was one of the first major examples in history of a cyber attack being used as a weapon of war.
This is something remarkable about the Iran-Israel conflict. It is not just fought with guns and missiles. It is fought in the shadows, through spies, through computer code, through assassinations, and through proxy forces. It is a multi-layered conflict happening on many different levels at the same time.
And this brings us to one of the most important concepts in understanding this conflict, the idea of proxy warfare. A proxy war is when two powerful actors do not fight each other directly, but instead support other groups or countries to fight on their behalf.
Iran has become very skilled at proxy warfare. Over the decades, Iran has built relationships with and provided weapons, training, and funding to several armed groups across the Middle East. These groups share Iran's goals, and they operate in different countries, acting on Iran's behalf.
The most well-known of these groups is Hezbollah, a powerful military and political organization based in Lebanon. Hezbollah was actually created by Iran in the early 1980s following Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Iran helped build Hezbollah, and it remains one of Iran's closest and most powerful allies.
Hezbollah has fought multiple wars with Israel over the decades. It sits right on Israel's northern border in Lebanon, armed with thousands of rockets. From Israel's perspective, Hezbollah is Iran's forward military presence, a constant threat sitting just kilometers from Israeli towns and cities.
Iran has also supported Hamas, the militant group that controls the Gaza Strip, the small territory on Israel's southwestern border. Hamas and Israel have fought multiple wars as well, including the devastating conflict that began in October of 2023, which shocked the entire world.
And Iran also has relationships with Houthi rebels in Yemen, with various militias in Iraq, and with other groups in Syria. Together, these groups form what Iran calls the Axis of Resistance, a network of allies that stretch from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean Sea.
From Iran's perspective, this network is necessary. Iran sees itself as surrounded by American military bases and Israeli influence. Creating this ring of allies, this circle of friendly forces, is Iran's way of defending itself and projecting power without having to directly confront its enemies in a full-scale war.
But from Israel's perspective, this network is deeply threatening. Every one of these groups is armed, hostile to Israel, and supported by a government that openly says Israel should not exist. So Israel sees this not as Iran's self-defense, but as a slow, strategic encirclement.
And this is one of the hardest things about understanding this conflict. Both sides have a perspective that makes sense from their own point of view, and yet the result is a situation that is extremely dangerous for everyone involved.
Let us talk about the direct confrontations, because for a long time, Iran and Israel did not attack each other directly. They fought through proxies. They conducted covert operations, but they avoided open, direct military engagement. That changed in a very significant way in recent years.
The shift began in Syria. Syria's civil war, which started in 2011, became a very complicated battlefield. Iran sent military forces to support Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and Israel, which shares a border with Syria, became increasingly worried about Iran establishing a permanent military presence right next door.
Israel began conducting hundreds of airstrikes inside Syria, mostly targeting Iranian weapons shipments being sent to Hezbollah and Iranian military installations near Israel's border. Iran usually did not respond directly to these strikes, but tensions kept building year after year.
Then came April 2024, a moment that marked a genuine turning point in this conflict. Israel conducted an airstrike on what Iran said was its consulate building in Damascus, Syria. Several senior Iranian military commanders were killed in that strike.
Iran's response was unprecedented. For the first time in history, Iran launched a direct military attack on Israeli territory, firing over 300 drones and missiles towards Israel. It was a massive, public, direct attack. The world held its breath.
Israel, with help from the United States, the United Kingdom, Jordan, and even some Arab countries, managed to intercept and destroy the vast majority of those drones and missiles. The physical damage inside Israel was minimal, but the symbolic significance was enormous.
The first time the shadow war had come into the open, the conflict that had been fought through proxies and covert operations had now crossed into direct confrontation. It was a new chapter, and a deeply alarming one.
Israel then launched its own retaliatory strike inside Iran, something that would have been almost unthinkable just a few years before. The cycle of direct action and response had officially begun, and the world was watching nervously, hoping it would not escalate further.
Now, let us step back and ask the question that's in the title of today's episode. Who started it? Because that's what so many people want to know. And the honest answer is that this question is much more complicated than it might seem.
If you ask that question in a simple, short-term way, you might say, well, this specific exchange of attacks started because of this specific incident. And depending on which incident you choose, you might blame Iran, or you might blame Israel. It really depends on where you start the clock.
That is exactly right. If you start the clock at 1979, you might say that the Iranian Revolution started the modern conflict by turning a cooperative relationship into a hostile one. If you start the clock at Israel's military activities in Syria, you might say Israel escalated the situation. The starting point changes everything.
And that is actually one of the most important lessons of this entire conversation. In long, complex conflicts, there is rarely one single person or one single country that started it. There are layers of history, layers of grievance, layers of fear and mistrust built up over decades.
Both Iran and Israel have real historical experiences that shape their behavior. Iran experienced a revolution, a brutal 8-year war, decades of economic sanctions, covert attacks on its scientists and facilities. Those experiences create a deep sense of being under siege.
And Israel, a small country created in the aftermath of the Holocaust, surrounded by neighbors who initially refused to accept its existence, facing ongoing rocket attacks and threats, that experience also creates a deep sense of vulnerability and the constant need to defend itself.
Neither of these experiences justifies violence against civilians, but understanding these experiences is essential if we want to understand why this conflict exists and why it continues. History is not just background. History is the fuel that keeps these fires burning.
There is also a very important religious and ideological dimension to this conflict that we should not overlook. For the Islamic Republic of Iran, not for all Iranian people, but for the government, opposing Israel is not just a political position, it is an ideological and religious commitment.
Khomeini established the idea that supporting the Palestinian cause and opposing Zionism, the movement for a Jewish homeland, was a religious duty. Every year, Iran marks Quds Day, a day dedicated to the cause of Jerusalem and Palestinian liberation. This is part of the Islamic Republic's identity.
This ideological element makes the conflict harder to resolve through normal diplomacy. When a position is based on religion and identity, not just on practical interests, it becomes much more difficult to negotiate. You cannot easily compromise on something you believe is a matter of faith.
But it is also important to say, and this is a point that often gets lost, that the Iranian government's position is not the same as the Iranian people's position. Iran is a country of over 80 million people. Many Iranians, especially younger generations, do not share the same intense hostility toward Israel that their government expresses.
There's actually a long history of warmth between ordinary Jewish people and ordinary Persian people, going back thousands of years. The ancient Persian king Cyrus the Great is celebrated in the Hebrew Bible for freeing Jewish people from captivity in Babylon. That history is real and meaningful.
And today, many young Iranians follow Israeli musicians, athletes, and influencers online. When Iranian and Israeli athletes have met at international competitions, some of them have refused to follow their government's instruction to avoid competing against Israelis. These small moments tell a different story from the official one.
Similarly, Israeli society is not monolithic. There are Israelis who support aggressive military action and those who strongly believe in dialogue and a two-state solution. There are Israeli human rights organizations that criticize their own government's policies towards Palestinians. The reality is always more complex than the official narrative.
This is such an important point. In every conflict, there is a government and there are people, and these are not always the same thing. When we talk about Iran versus Israel, we are mostly talking about governments, military forces, and ideologies, not about the millions of ordinary human beings on both sides who just want to live in peace.
Now, let us talk about what's really at stake in this conflict, because it goes far beyond just two countries. The Iran-Israel conflict has implications for the entire Middle East and for global security.
One of the biggest concerns is nuclear escalation. Iran has been slowly advancing its nuclear program despite international pressure. As of recent years, experts believe Iran has enough enriched uranium to potentially build nuclear weapons relatively quickly if it chose to do so. This is something Israel considers an absolute red line.
Israel itself is widely believed to possess nuclear weapons, though it has never officially confirmed this. The policy is called nuclear ambiguity. But if Iran were to develop nuclear weapons, the entire strategic balance of the Middle East would change dramatically. Other countries in the region might seek their own nuclear weapons. The risks would multiply.
There is also the oil factor. The Persian Gulf, the body of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, carries a huge portion of the world's oil supply. Any major conflict in this region would affect oil prices and energy supplies globally.
The economic consequences of a full-scale Iran-Israel war would be felt far beyond the Middle East. And then there's the question of American involvement. America has a security commitment to Israel. If Israel were in serious danger, America would almost certainly become involved militarily, and that opens up a much larger conflict with global implications.
Russia and China also have interests in this region. Russia has been increasingly close to Iran, especially since the war in Ukraine. China is heavily dependent on Iranian oil, so the Iran-Israel conflict sits inside a much larger web of global power competition. Nothing happens in isolation.
This is what makes this conflict so important for people everywhere to understand, not just people in the Middle East. The decisions made by leaders in Tehran and Tel Aviv have consequences that ripple outward in ways that affect everyone, from energy prices to global security.
So what does the future hold? This is the hardest question of all, and honestly, nobody can answer it with certainty. But we can identify the key factors that will determine how this story develops.
The first factor is the nuclear question. How far will Iran go with its nuclear program, and how will Israel and the international community respond? This is the most dangerous point of tension, and the one most likely to trigger a major escalation.
The second factor is the situation in Gaza and Lebanon. The October 2023 Hamas attack on Israel and Israel's subsequent military campaign in Gaza reshaped the entire regional dynamic. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanon, all of this is deeply connected to the Iran-Israel conflict because Iran is connected to these groups.
The third factor is the possibility of diplomacy. History has shown that even the most bitter enemies can eventually reach agreements. The United States and Iran came close to a nuclear deal under the Obama administration in 2015, and parts of that deal were implemented before they collapsed under the Trump administration. Diplomacy is always possible. It just requires political will on all sides.
And the fourth factor, perhaps the most human and hopeful one, is the question of whether ordinary people, on both sides, will eventually have more influence over their governments than the ideologues and hardliners do. History has examples of conflicts that seemed impossible to resolve, and then were resolved slowly and painfully through dialogue.
Think of South Africa and apartheid. Think of Northern Ireland. Think of the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union. These were conflicts that seemed permanent, impossible to end, and yet they changed. Not easily, not quickly, and not without great suffering, but they changed.
That does not mean the Iran-Israel conflict will necessarily end peacefully or soon, but it does mean that the future is not fixed. History is made by choices, by leaders, by societies, by individuals, and choices can change.
So let us bring this all together. We have covered a lot of ground today, and I want to make sure we leave you with a clear picture of what we discussed.
Yes, let us do a quick, natural summary before we close out. The Iran-Israel conflict is not ancient. It is mostly a product of the 20th century.
And it did not start with hostility. It started with a working relationship. Iran and Israel were actually on the same side for much of the Cold War era. They had shared interests, diplomatic ties, and practical cooperation. That relationship existed under the Iranian monarchy, which was supported by the United States and Western powers.
The turning point was 1979. The Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah and brought Ayatollah Khomeini to power. The new Islamic Republic was ideologically committed to opposing Israel and American influence. From that year forward, Iran and Israel became adversaries.
The conflict developed through multiple layers: the nuclear program, the use of proxy groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, covert operations, economic pressure, and years of shadow warfare. For decades, the two countries avoided direct confrontation while still fighting each other through other means.
In 2024, that changed. Direct attacks and counterattacks marked a dangerous escalation in a conflict that had remained just below the surface for over 40 years. The world is now watching a situation that is more openly dangerous than ever before.
And when we ask who started it, the honest answer is that this conflict has roots and causes on multiple sides, built up over many decades. Understanding those roots is the only way to think clearly about what is happening and what might come next.
Both governments have made choices that increased the danger. Both have histories of grievance and fear that shaped those choices. And millions of ordinary people, Iranian, Israeli, Palestinian, Lebanese, and beyond, are living with the consequences of decisions made by governments and ideologies.
Our hope in doing this episode is simply that you understand this conflict a little better than you did before. Not to take a side, but to see the full picture, because the full picture is the only honest picture.
And understanding history does not mean accepting violence or injustice. It means having the knowledge to think, to ask better questions, and to form your own informed view. That is something worth working toward, in your English and in your understanding of the world.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. This was a heavier topic than usual, and we are genuinely grateful that you stayed with us through the whole conversation. Your time and attention mean a great deal to us.
Yes, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Topics like this take courage to engage with, courage to listen, to question, and to sit with complexity rather than looking for simple answers. You did that today, and we're proud of you for it.
Before we go, we want to gently invite you to explore some of the other episodes we have available on the Easy English Talk podcast channel. We have conversations on communication, confidence, personal growth, decision-making, and many other topics that we think you will find valuable.
Each episode is designed to help you grow, not just in your English, but in the way you think and understand the world. So if today's episode gave you something useful, we think you'll find a lot more waiting for you on the channel.
Browse through the episodes, find the topics that speak to you, and keep listening, keep learning, and keep growing. That's what this podcast is all about. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Goodbye for now, everyone. Stay curious, stay kind, and keep going. We'll be right here whenever you're ready.